uns im Studio Joe Sacco und natürlich werden wir über seine Werke über den Ersten Weltkrieg sprechen und ja, uns auch nochmal den Leporello anschauen, den wir gestern mal aufgefaltet haben und wir werden dann mal zeigen, wie das ausschaut. Welcome to our studio, Joe Sacco.
Thank you.
And of course we will talk about your work about the First World War and especially, first of all, the Leporello, which I have here, which is so big. We opened it yesterday on the hallway outside. It almost filled the hallway. How long did it take to make it?
Well, if you're just talking about the drawing, about 8 months. So not so long really, though I thought it would take about 4 months. But the detail got the best of me, so it just took a bit longer than I thought it would take.
So you could say 1 meter in 1 month.
That's maybe a meter, yeah, about a meter a month. I guess that's one way of looking at it, yeah.
Why did you make something like this? When you usually you make comic books, of course.
Why did I make something like this?
Yeah, why did you make such a Leporello?
Well, I mean, partly I just wanted a creative change from what I've been doing for many years, which is journalism. But this particular subject has been of interest to me since I was a child. I grew up in Australia, where the First World War figures very, in a big way, in the Australian national psyche. So I sort of grew up with a lot of stories about the First World War and what happened to Australia, and then what happened to the British forces in World War I. And so you could say from about the age of 10, I've been fascinated by the war. Just the horror of it, the scale of it, and I guess I would say in some ways the pointlessness of it. So that stuck with me. I've continued to read books about the First World War, and finally an editor approached me and said, do you want to draw a panorama of the Western Front? And my initial reaction was no, because it was so different from anything I'd done before, but then I thought about it and I thought, you know, I spent so much time thinking about the First World War, but maybe it's time to do something about it.
And why are you so much interested in a theme which is so long, which has been there for so long?
Why I'm interested in this particular theme? Because it's stuck with me for a long time. As I said, like since I was a kid. This book helped me think of what I'm interested in, which is why people fight. Think of it in a different way. With my journalism, I sort of try to explain it from an individual point of view. I talk about the individual as he or she is affected by war. In this case, I was interested in sort of people behaving as a group, as a mass, and that's what I wanted to examine. And drawing something like this with many people gives you a chance to sort of reflect on that. Why do we do what we do? Why were these people enthusiastic about this war? Which obviously that enthusiasm met reality at some point on the battlefield.
It's so strange because we talk a lot about the Second World War. There was a festivity right now, some days ago, in France for the D-Day, but we don't talk that much about the First World War. Why is that? So what do you think?
Well, it depends where you are. In the United States, they don't talk about the First World War, they talk about the Second. In the UK, they talk about the First World War. They lost more troops in the First World War, as the French did. The French lost a lot more troops in World War I than World War II. And it was fought on their soil. So if you talk to someone from Britain, in some ways, the World War I has a greater resonance. Most of the memorials are World War I memorials in Britain. And when, after World War II, they never really built World War II memorials. They just added names on World War I monuments so that World War I just figures in a bigger way. In certain cultures, not in all.
Especially in Germany, it doesn't figure that much. It was the reason for continuing wars. It was a reason to build World War II. But
right. You could say World War II, to a large extent, was a development of World War I. That maybe they were the same war on some level. But I mean, the Germans, I think, don't talk about the wars as far as military battles. They talk about the wars as far as World War II, especially, of course, as far as like internal problems with the Nazis, and what the Nazis did. That's your vision of World War II, probably. So you don't talk about the military aspects as much, I've noticed.
Well, yes. In some respect, you're right. In some other respect, especially I am very interested in the military developments. But I noticed when the discussion came up about World War I, because now it's 100 years ago that it started, that I don't know that much about the World War I. And I wonder why. Because I think it is because World War II is so much in our minds.
Right.
Is so much in our death, because we are responsible, we as German, we are responsible for the Holocaust. And World War I, what was it? Nothing.
Right. No, I understand that. World War I, you know, people should remember, redrew the map of Europe that caused some of the problems of World War II. The map of the Middle East was completely changed after World War I because the French and the British basically divided up spheres of influence. And we have wars are being fought today because of those decisions they made right after the war. I mean, Kuwait was a creation of the British right after World War I. After the Ottoman Empire was destroyed or faded away after the First World War was defeated, other powers moved in. So we do live with the consequences of World War I, whether we know them, whether we know it or not. But I think on a larger scale, what's interesting about the war is that large groups of people from all over Europe sort of had enthusiasm to go and fight, and then they found themselves locked in this trench warfare, which must have seemed pretty hopeless and pointless. The front hardly moved at all for a number of years. So people waited in their trenches, being bombarded by artillery, and it was kind of the first war you could say there was industrial scale killing. You know, on an average day, when there was no regular large-scale battle, the British were losing 350 men. That's kind of astounding when you think about it. And then in this particular battle, on the first day, 60,000 British soldiers were casualties, of which 20,000 were killed. That's an enormous figure. And you know, let's say I'm talking to an American audience who they don't really know about World War I. I tell them that it's estimated in the first hour of the first day of the Battle of the Somme that 10,000 British soldiers were killed. And I say that's more than all the US servicemen killed in Iraq and Afghanistan combined. And then you get an idea of the scale. Because you lose an individual soldier, there's a great amount of suffering and grief for that family and for those friends of that person. Then imagine that multiplied on that scale. And it was a particular day in World War I, but it was very emblematic of how the war was fought and large numbers of people who died for almost no gain.
But it gave you more chance to make a drawing, because it didn't move that much. It was frontier, which was there for years.
Yeah, it was static.
Yeah.
And it's always interested me, the idea of people in these trenches. I mean, now we think of it as quite primitive, but this was a pretty educated group of people that were fighting. I mean, you could say the average British soldier was quite well educated. So the fact that they submitted to this sort of thing is what interests me. The fact that people let themselves stay there is what interests me. I mean, in the next year, the French army had a disaster of their own, one of many, but a disaster of such magnitude that many French soldiers refused to leave their trenches. They refused to go on the attack. They actually mutinied, and a number of soldiers were shot, you know, just to sort of instill discipline again. But to me, that seems like a very sane act, to sort of say, no, we're not. We know the generals are just shoveling us into the furnace, and there's no gain. So what's the point, basically? It seems like one of the saner acts in a war that seems insane.
Yeah, I can imagine that, because one of my grandfathers said no, and he helped other people to escape, and he was shot because of this.
So during the Second World War?
During the Second World War, yeah. It was something I found out just 20 years ago, and when my parents told me that, I was surprised. I said, okay, well, we have kind of a hero in the family.
To me, that seems a more heroic act.
Yeah.
To sort of go against your state's ideology and to not grow with the group, and the group wants to sort of go together, to actually take a step back and say, no, I don't care how many people think this is the right thing to do or tell me it's the right thing to do, I know what's right in my heart. So, you know, your grandfather is a hero in the true sense of the word.
And I thought about it, would I have done the same thing? And I came to the conclusion, yes, I would have done it. Because I can't stand things that are wrong. So.
No, that's good, but you know, you wonder what would you have done at a certain age, and sometimes I think if I was 18 or 19, I might have been swept up. Not necessarily in the politics of it, but of the sense of the great adventure. You don't want to miss out on your generation's great adventure, which of course, that adventure gets extremely brutal, and I'm sure at some point you say, I didn't realize it was going to be anything like this. I mean, if you look at me now, I might say, no, I'm not going to go, whatever the consequences. But if I was younger, knowing what my mind was like when I was 18 or 19, who knows? Probably would have gone.
What are you going to do as the next thing? What are your plans?
Well, the next book, I finished it just before I came to Europe, and it's a satire. It's about 120 pages long, also very different from anything I've done before. And it's an underground comic in the true sense of the word. It's very underground, borderline obscene. It's very different.
Is this something what is typical for you, that you look for different things? And
it hasn't been, but I've always wanted to think of myself as a cartoonist and not a journalist. I do journalism in the comics form, but ultimately I call myself a cartoonist because there are other things you can do with comics other than journalism, obviously. They take a long time to do those books, so you do 3 or 4 books and suddenly 20 years have gone by. And then you still have other ideas that you want to approach, but I've wanted to do something different and I've needed to, and now I sort of am. I'll go back to journalism, but I've needed to try some other things.
Okay, so I'm looking forward to
Thank you.
read these books, and well, maybe in 2 years we will see us again and talk about this book. Have you seen some of the exhibitions of the World War I?
I haven't, not yet. I'm going to see them today. I like Jacques Tardy's work quite a bit, but I know there's some Otto Dix in there and some French painters or illustrators with whom I'm not familiar.
Have you had the opportunity to talk with Jacques Tardy?
I didn't see him here. We were sort of going in different directions, but I saw him once. I met him once in France, and this was at a time when I was sort of thinking about doing a World War I project, but I had no clue. And I told him basically I didn't think I was going to do anything about the First World War because his work is so outstanding, and it sort of says a lot of things I would have said anyway. So I thought that he's really done it right. And I told him this, and he said, no, you should try. So when an editor suggested this format, and when I began to think, oh, I don't need to have any words in this, it suddenly became appealing to me because I felt like I could maybe approach it in a different way.
Okay, so thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for this great Leporello. I can only suggest to everyone to look at it and to buy it, because it's really very interesting, a different way to look at the war. And thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.